Welcome back everyone to the Fighting Post. Before we get started with this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. It really goes a long way with helping a small channel out like this one. And so for today's topic, I wanted to get into the fight that has been kind of slept on as of late, especially with like news of Canelo, Crawford, and Benavidez and Morrell, and that's the Jaron Ennis versus Stanionis fight. So this has been a fight that we were hoping Jaron Ennis would get, especially after all the talks of him ducking a matchup with Virgil Ortiz. Now that matchup, and that particular fight is one that we've been wanting for the last few years. Honestly, from a business perspective, it still kind of hasn't made sense yet because neither fighter has really risen to the level of popularity that they would expect them to, being that at one point Virgil and Boots were looked at as the two, future top welterweights. And as we all know, the welterweight division, especially after, the heavyweight division that Muhammad Ali had, the welterweight division around the time of Sugar Ray Leonard and, and Tommy Hearns and Roberto Duran, it really became the glamour division. And it was the first time that these like smaller fighters were really seen as like major stars in the sport. And especially here in the West, and I'd say in America, the welterweight division is about the average size of a guy, right? Typically the fighters are somewhere between like, 5'7", 5'9". Their walk-around weight is probably somewhere around like 160 to like maybe 180 pounds. And so there's going to be a vast majority of talent that falls within that, fighter bracket. And so a lot of the like greatest fighters with like the best combination of both, power, speed, agility, and all that typically fight at this weight. Because in the lower weight classes, you have fighters that are talented, that throw lots of punches, but they don't really get the knockouts because their punches just aren't, hitting as hard for the most part. I mean, there's obviously exceptions, but, for the most part, you see, 1,000+ rounds thrown per fight on the regular because the punches just aren't having the same sting. And when it comes to the welterweight division, again, for the most part, you'll see a lot less, technical fighters that are super agile. You'll see these big bombs being thrown that typically knock people out. And you'll see a lot more knockouts and single punch knockouts, I should say, in the heavyweight division. And so the welterweight division is kind of like the best combination of everything, right? You get the talented fighters that are able to cut angles. You get the ones that have plenty of power. You get those that are a little bit faster than you would typically see. And after the Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford saga, we were kind of left in this weird limbo where we weren't sure who the best welterweight was moving forward. When Crawford moved up to 154 pounds to fight Madrimov, all of his welterweight titles essentially became dispersed. And you had Mario Barrios picking up the WBC, you had Brian Norman Jr. picking up the WBO, you had Amanda Stanionis picking up the WBA, and then you had Jaron Ennis picking up the IBF. Now what this does is that it now creates this like weird dynamic in the welterweight division where we're not really sure who the best fighter is. Now, of course, from an eye test and from, the fact that Boots was the runner-up to face Crawford and we all wanted him to face him as his mandatory, we could all assume that Boots was probably going to be the best welterweight post Crawford and Spence. But until the fights happen, we're never really sure, right? And so that's why it was a huge disappointment when the negotiations between Jaron Ennis and Brian Norman Jr. fell through. Now, whether you think Brian Norman Jr. was ducking or who was in the right, who was in the wrong, regardless of the situation, we didn't end up seeing the fight. The reason that I recall, and if I remember correctly off the top of my head, was that Brian Norman Jr. wanted a slightly higher purse for the fight than what was being offered by Eddie Hearn and Matchroom. I believe it was somewhere like around $1 million and some change. And the logic behind that was that Brian Norman Jr., after paying his coaches, his training fees for his camp, and taxes and all that kind of stuff, because you can never write that off. He was going to end up with less than like $1 million, and so he felt that now that he was a champion, his value went up more. And again, these fighters are putting their lives on the line. I can never tell a fighter that he's getting paid too little or too much for what it is he's doing, but So I could understand the reason and the logic behind wanting to do that. Would maybe, you know, would Brian Norman Jr. perhaps have been better off fighting Boots? Maybe, but the truth of the matter is that we're not in that position where, you know, we should even be counting other people's pockets and telling them what they should and shouldn't take, right? I mean, at the end of the day, again, like I already stated, these guys are risking their lives for our entertainment. And so that fight not happening was a real, you know, it kind of sucked because we were left with Jaron Boots Ennis fighting Karen Kukajan or whatever his name is for the second time, that rematch. And originally when we were thinking that Jaron Boots Ennis was the best welterweight and that he could compete with Crawford and we wanted to see him fight Crawford, you know, this was pre-Karen fight, the first fight. On the Gervonta Davis undercard with Hector, I believe it was against Hector Luis Garcia, Jaron Boots Ennis fought Karen for the first time, and he showed the inability to cut off the ring and to almost have a one-track mind. For as versatile and as technically savvy as Jaron Boots Ennis is, he has shown on multiple occasions that once he has a game plan set, he's pretty much going to stick to that game plan, and he's not really going to adapt mid-fight. A lot of the fighters that he's looked great against, for example, Roman Villa, were stand-up, straight up and down targets for him to practice on. And so it was easy to do some of the showboating and some of the, you know, more illustrious and more eye-catching showboating moves than it would be fighting a fighter like Karen, who's not going to sit there in the pocket and, you know, give you the kind of fighting style that you would want. So in that first fight, Boots kind of showed that he had an inability to cut the ring and adapt mid-fight, and it honestly led to a really dreadful watch. In his comeback fight, Eddie Hearn wanted to match him up with a like opponent to Terrence Crawford, which is something that is commonly done in boxing, right? If you want to get a certain matchup going, you'll match him up. You'll match up a fighter with a common opponent. You know, hopefully your fighter does better than the previous fighter, and it'll, you know, build some hype, some buzz around the fight. But in that particular fight, a lot of people, rather than answering the questions that Jaron Boots Ennis left, he kind of opened up a new can of worms for people. For one, he was getting hit a lot in that fight. And we always give Crawford the notion that he gets hit way too much in fights as well. But the response to that is that most people say, well, he's just a dog. He's gonna, you know, he's gonna give one and take one. He's gonna take one to give one, I should say. And I think Jaron is probably cut from the same cloth in regards to that. So I think the criticism is a bit much on that end. Like, I believe that Crawford probably felt Avanesian's power and thought, like, you know what, this is not really too big of a deal. Like, I can take it. It's not really too much of a problem. The issue with that fighting style is that at a certain level, yeah, that works. But once you get to the elite of the elite, the prime, like, world champions, it becomes a problem to be consistently taking punches that you shouldn't be taking. So there was a clear gap of experience between Jaron Boots Ennis and Crawford, and that matchup became intriguing from a fan's perspective, right? Like, oh, could this young, hungry lion beat the aging world champion? But all of us secretly kind of had an idea that Crawford would be able to handle him for the most part, right? I mean, it would have been a tough fight, but, you know, regardless, Crawford would have most likely had the win. And so in hindsight, we're able to see that that fight probably wasn't going to be the most, you know, that fight probably wasn't going to be the competitive fight that we expected it to be, which is why I go back to saying that we have to see the fights before we decide who the best welterweight is or who the best fighter in the division is. Like, we always keep saying styles make fights, and so I think this is one of those cases where we just don't know who the best welterweight is for the most part. I think we're all under the assumption, and I would kind of agree with this sentiment as well, that based on the eye test, based on his competition level, that Jaron Boots Ennis is probably the #1 welterweight right now, with Stanionis being the second best welterweight. The issue with Stanionis is that he has been extremely inactive. I believe the fight that impressed most of us was the one against Butayev, but that one happened, I believe, on the Errol Spence and Yordenis Ugas undercard, and that was in 2022. So besides that fight, Stanionis has only been in the ring one additional time, and he didn't look too great in this fight. Like, Stanionis is a fighter that comes forward a lot, applies intelligent pressure. Like, he's not just some, like, straight up come forward, take hit Mexican style type of thing, but you know, he is definitely a fighter that is willing to, you know, take punishment in order to get off some of his shots. But the fact that Stanionis has been relatively inactive, you know, it's not going to help him in a fight against Jaron Ennis, who's been, you know, credit to Eddie Hearn, putting him in these matchups that have consistently been happening every 3-4 months. When it comes to, you know, Brian Norman Jr., I would say he's probably the third best welterweight in the division. And honestly, the win that Brian Norman Jr. has against Giovanni, who had just beat Alexis Rocha, who was rated not too low in the top 10 list of best welterweights when Crawford and Earl Spence were in the picture. Santayin beat Rocha pretty handedly and gave him a beatdown that honestly I don't really think he's recovered from. And Brian Norman Jr., again, you know, styles make fights, but Brian Norman Jr. was able to handle him pretty convincingly and get an electrifying stoppage that I think only boosted his profile. When it comes to Brian Norman Jr., while he has had a slight step up in the level of his competition, I don't think he's quite there yet on, you know, in terms of experience. When it comes to Mario Barrios, I think he's a case of like, you know, he's not the most talented fighter, but he's dedicated. He's willing to work hard, train hard, and fight the best out there. But he's kind of always going to come just a little bit short of like the cream of the crop, right? Like he's never going to be, at least I don't think, Mario Barrios is never going to be a great fighter. He's going to be a good fighter, someone that eventually might become unified, but not someone that we're going to look back as like, wow, like that was a really great, you know, fighter that, you know, did so much in his career. So when Mario Barrios fought Keith Thurman, this was a Keith Thurman that looked at Barrios as a tune-up fight. He came and fought him after a few years of after a couple-year layoff after the Manny Pacquiao loss. And so this was a Thurman that was plagued by injuries. And yes, at one point Thurman was the best welterweight in the division, but that wasn't the Thurman that Mario Barrios was fighting. And Mario Barrios showed that he could be easily outboxed, and he got completely outboxed by Keith Thurman. There was a punch, I believe, in the second half of the fight that Mario Barrios landed to Keith Thurman's body, but even then, it wasn't enough to actually put Keith Thurman down or to stop the momentum that Keith Thurman had in that fight. Previous to the Keith Thurman fight, and I know that Mario Barrios was weight drained, so, you know, I completely understand that a fighter could be weaker, especially if they're not fighting at their ideal weight. But he did get stopped and dropped by Gervonta Davis. And Gervonta, while he is known as a power puncher, he's a relatively smaller fighter. And so the fact that Mario Barrios has been down on the canvas, you know, goes again, the old saying, like, once you've been knocked out once, you know, your chin starts going and it's a lot easier to get knocked out again. And so the fact that Mario Barrios has been down before, knocked out before, leaves him susceptible to be knocked out again. And when it comes to his most recent fight against Abel Ramos, a fight that was supposed to test him, but not, you know, take him into super deep waters. Like, I think that fight was made to make Mario Barrios look good, especially after picking up the WBC title. And so I don't think that that fight went the way his handlers assumed that it would go. And Mario Barrios again showed that at like that contender level, that's kind of where he's at, you know what I mean? Like, he's not really going to be that elite world champion that dominates his competition, and you can just tell that he's a good fighter. I enjoy watching Mario Barrios, but again, I don't think he's going to be a great fighter. And so essentially what that leaves us with is the number 1 and the number 2 fighters in the welterweight division going against each other. Now, this matchup, I think, is probably the best stylistically, because Jaron Ennis does the best, and I would say is the most impressive when he's going against a fighter who's willing to engage. The only fight that I would give an exception to when it comes to that statement is his last fight with Karen. But I believe that that's because he expected Karen to jab and move and hold similarly as he did in the first fight, which again goes back to what I said about Jaron Ennis not really being able to adapt mid-fight. But for all the fights he's had, and for as old as Jaron Ennis is, I don't think he's had that level of like elite experience yet. And so he still has a few more fights before I think we can consider him like, you know, the best welterweight and one of the best like pound for pound fighters in the world. Which Stanionis has shown that he can give any fighter, you know, major problems. From what I've read in interviews and what I've seen and heard, he gives a lot of elite fighters problems in sparring. And I know that sparring is completely different from competing at in an actual fight, because, you know, headgear and the glove size and things like that. But Stanionis is one of those fighters that, you know, he's been in the ring with elite competition, whether it's for an actual fight or whether it's for sparring. And all that experience just kind of adds to his capability and his mindset that he can probably go into this fight and win it overall. Now, without giving a full breakdown, because I'll probably save that for some other time, especially closer to the fight, because this fight's not till April. I personally think that at the moment, I have Jaron Boots Ennis winning, but not for the reasons you guys would think. Like, most people would think that Jaron Boots Ennis would win because of his skill and because of his talent and that kind of stuff. But I think in this particular situation, I think the inactivity of Stanionis is going to play more of a role in this fight than the actual ability of Jaron Boots Ennis. Now, Jaron will get full credit for this win for me. I'm not making any excuses. I favor him to win this fight. But there's things to keep in mind that as boxing fans we often overlook, especially with a fighter like Stanionis that doesn't necessarily have like this full fan base behind him. These kind of guys often get overlooked. And so, you know, the fact that he's been in and out of the ring and things like that, I think might play a detriment to him in this fight. But again, like, this is the #1 and the #2 welterweights fighting, and I think that since Jaron Boots Ennis passed on the Brian Norman Jr. fight, since he passed, you know, or I shouldn't say passed, I should say since Jaron Boots Ennis wasn't able to get, you know, the Virgil Ortiz fight or the Brian Norman Jr. fight or that Teofimo Lopez fight, not only am I glad that Jaron Boots Ennis is unifying the titles, but I'm extremely happy with the fact that it's against what most of us would consider to be the second best welterweight. It's going to be an interesting match of styles, and we're finally going to get to see Jaron Boots Ennis accomplish his dream of becoming a unified welterweight champion. And we'll finally be able to kind of put a stamp on who the best welterweight in the division is. Now, of course, he's going to have two more belts to collect, but I think that Eddie Hearn is probably going to try to make the Conor Benn versus Mario Barrios fight if he's not able to get the Chris Eubank thing going. And Brian Norman Jr. will probably be the last puzzle piece when it comes to this like undisputed run. However, if Jaron Boots Ennis is able to make a fight at 154 after, you know, his single unification, I wouldn't be upset with him moving up either. Like, I think the fact that he's fighting the second best fighter in the division, you know, I think that'll be enough. I think it'll answer questions for many people. And again, unfortunately, the welterweight division is in a limbo right now. What's normally known as one of the hottest divisions in boxing, especially, you know, as we had previously discussed, especially after like Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Floyd Mayweather, Oscar De La Hoya, Manny Pacquiao, you know, we're not seeing the stars that we used to see in that division. And so while it kind of sucks from a boxing perspective that, you know, one of the historically greatest divisions, it doesn't have the superstars or the, you know, or the talent that it once did, it's nice that we're finally going to get to see a unification.